The Dr. Taz Show, the podcast. Dr. Taz, Superwoman Wellness. Here's Dr. Taz.
Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Superwoman Wellness, where you know I am determined to bring you back to your superpowered self. And in this episode, that includes our children. If you are a mom, and all of us have been a mom to someone at some point in our journey, then this is a really important topic. Getting nutrition right for our kids is something that keeps us up at night. I know I'm still there. I have a 13-year-old and 12-year-old, and it's still happening. Well, joining me today are two women who are determined to help us with that whole dilemma. Let me introduce them. I have both Alexandra Caspero and Whitney English. Alexandra is a registered dietitian and nutritionist with more than 10 years experience counseling on plant-based diets and sports nutrition. So interesting. Her award-winning website, Delish Knowledge, makes whole food, plant-based eating deliciously simple. She's the author of Fresh Italian Cooking for the New Generation, which features 100 plus predominantly plant-based Italian recipes. That sounds like it doesn't go together, but we'll get there. Whitney English, on the other hand, is also a registered dietitian, nutritionist, and a journalist who has reported in the health and wellness space for more than 10 years. Her website, YouTube channel, and social media platforms, Whitney ERD, provide readers with evidence-based, easily digestible information on popular nutrition topics and healthy original recipes. Welcome to the show, ladies. We need you. We're happy to have you guys here. What in the world inspired the two of you to jump into the plant-based community, especially when it comes to those picky, fussy kids?
Yeah. So, Whitney and I have been friends for a little over a decade now, both dietitians, of course, and then really started our families around the same time. And at that point, we were just sort of frustrated that we couldn't find evidence-based guidance when it came to raising our kids this way. And we felt like, okay, if we're having a hard time sifting through the research, then other parents are likely in the same boat. And that's really the catalyst that allowed us to start Plant-Based Juniors, but then also really, why we wrote this book, to sort of answer all of the questions that we had during that time.
And why plant-based? Why so focused there out of curiosity? And by the way, it just boggles my mind. I'm sure you guys are following all the studies, but the recent study on prepared baby food and all the heavy metals and prepared, even what's like we used to consider healthy and organic baby food, like all the contaminants and all that stuff in there. But just curious as to why you guys both focus so much on the plant-based portion of feeding children.
Yeah, so Alex and I were both following predominantly plant-based diets prior to having kids. And this is really based on the plethora of research showing that plant-based diets provide numerous health benefits, from a reduced rate of chronic diseases to increased health span, potentially even increased longevity. But like Alex said before, when we became parents, we were a little bit nervous. There's a lot of misinformation out there. And we weren't entirely sure that just because the diet was safe for us, that it was also going to be safe for children. Luckily, although there isn't as much research, especially on long-term outcomes like there is on adults, the research that we do have about kids points to the fact that it likely possesses the same type of benefits by starting a plant-based diet early in life. So kids that follow plant-based diets typically have lower rates of overweight and obesity. They typically have healthier body weights while still attaining a normal height and a normal weight. They get more fruits and vegetables. The average American child only eats, or only 1 in 10 of the average American child gets the right amount of fruits and vegetables. So that's a huge benefit if we can get them eating right early on. Only 1 in 10 kids gets the recommended amount of fiber, and plant-based kids typically get more fiber, more vitamin C, more folate. And then they also have lower levels of chronic disease risk factors, like lower levels of cholesterol, lower levels of inflammatory molecules. So we don't have those long-term outcomes studied, but we do have all of these acute effects that are showing that that a plant-based diet likely possesses those long-term health benefits.
Yeah, and I know that in the exam room, and I started my career in pediatrics, by the way, so I'm pretty passionate about children and children's health and trying to get this right. But I know in the exam room, in the older kids, for sure, we're seeing that shift in metabolic markers, right? Where we're seeing the higher cholesterol levels, the higher insulin levels, we're seeing, more fat deposition in general, along with our children, again, these older children sitting more, being more sedentary, all that other stuff. But what about the babies and the youngsters? Because I worry about protein, quite honestly. I mean, I've had cases where we've had, patients or parents where they, were predominantly plant-based, insisted on that for these young children. And a lot of the research we've got for the young ones really talks about the importance of protein and fat for the developing brain, for growth, and so much more. What would you say to that? Or is there an age at which we should really adopt this plant-based lifestyle?
Yeah, so those nutrients are of course important, right? So whether we're talking about fat, protein, the various micronutrients, iron, zinc, etc., we need all of these for critical growth and development. What we say is that we can also get these items in plants. So really our stance is we want to support parents and families who want to raise their kids either on a plant exclusive or a plant predominant diet, and say, this is sort of the research, the things that you need to be focused on, right? We do want to make sure that we're getting enough fat. Plant-based diets, one of the benefits, especially when it comes to adults, is the fact they tend to be a little bit lower naturally in fat, but we want to make sure that we're giving our children optimal amounts of fat, right? 30-40%, depending on what age they are. Protein, of course, we want to make sure that we're giving enough protein. That's why we also like to focus on serving adequate amounts of beans and soy-based products to ensure that we're getting all of those amino acids, especially lysine, which can be a little bit more limiting in a plant-based diet. But as long as you're sort of taking this well-planned approach, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Nutrition and Dietetics Association, the Canadian Pediatric Association, they all say that well-planned plant-based diets are safe, appropriate, and likely beneficial for all aspects of the life cycle, including infancy, pregnancy, lactation, and toddlerhood.
And if we're talking about protein specifically, the research actually shows that all kids, regardless of the diet they're following, are getting more protein than they need. So some studies have shown that plant-based kids, whether vegan or vegetarian, get about double the protein that's recommended per day, while omnivorous kids are getting about 3 times the protein. And again, protein is so important for growth and development, but too much of anything it can be a bad thing. So actually, there's also studies showing that kids who are getting an upwards of, say, 4 times the amount of protein that they need are at a higher risk of some of these diseases like obesity. So we really want our kids to be getting an optimal amount of protein, not too much, not too little. And all of the research shows that plant-based kids get it. And that makes sense because all whole plant foods contain protein. So we really only see protein malnutrition in underdeveloped countries.
And with the protein, like what would be your top picks for getting those protein numbers kind of where they need to be for a parent who's trying to plan a plate and think through like, okay, we've got antioxidants, fiber, where's the protein?
Yeah.
What are some of the picks that they could make there?
Yeah, so Alex and I created what we call the PB3 plate, which is a visual guide to meal planning for parents. It's this cute little graphic with little characters on there for each of the foods that we recommend. And this is really intended to take the guesswork out of meal planning for parents. As I said before, there's protein found in all whole plant foods, but our main sources where we're going to get a lot of it are in the legumes, nuts, and seeds category, and then in the grains and starches category. And those are 2 of the main PB3 categories. So things like beans, things like soy foods, whole grains. A lot of people don't realize that a major portion of your protein is going to be coming from grains. A slice of bread, for example, even refined bread, not the best source, but will have 4 to 6 grams of protein. So there's plenty of places to meet those needs. And for babies, it's really easy to meet their needs as well in age and texture appropriate form. So in our book, we've got things like millet meatballs that can be shaped for babies to pick up in their hands starting right at 6 months. We do a lot of legume pastas so that they can get extra protein and iron, again, in these like palmable forms.
I love that. I love those hacks because I think that's where people really struggle. It's like, how do I do this? How do I make this happen? Now, one of the benefits I think of sort of this approach is creating that palette, right? Mm-hmm. For fruits and vegetables and plant-based foods, and not creating this palette where it's only like, super starchy or meat and all that other stuff, or high salt foods. How does, if let's say you're new to this world and you want to make this transition, but you already have these palettes in your family that have adapted to high salt. Actually, I saw a patient today who is struggling with that. How do I adapt the entire family, who the children are now 10, 11, and 12? How do you adapt them to this new way of eating? What's your recommendation there? Because we know kids are picky eaters.
Yes.
As they get older, first they fight, then they ignore, and then as they get older, they just flat out defy. So how do you kind of get around some of those issues as you're trying to change, the taste literally in their mouth?
Yeah, so exactly like you said, right? It doesn't have to be overnight. It also doesn't have to be a complete shift all at once, right? We know that small changes can make a big difference, especially if we're talking about taste retraining, right? If we went into our family and said, okay, no more of the old food. This is sort of our new diet right now. You're going to be met with a mutiny, right? It's not going to go over very well.
Yeah.
But if we slowly start to adjust some of the salt intake, if we start to slowly adjust some of those higher fiber, more whole grain options, especially if you're used to only serving more of the more refined grains, this can take time. Nutrition is a long game, right? We're talking about slowly adjusting our kids' habits, our preferences, especially because we know so much of the benefits when it comes to plant-rich diets in older age. It doesn't have to be, completely done in 2 weeks or a month. If that means your child goes from 10% sort of this whole food, more plant-based diet to over a year or so is now eating even 50%, that's awesome, right?
Yeah.
We know that all aspects of plant-based eating, the more plants that we get on the plate is going to, have so many benefits. So it even doesn't have to be 100%. We really like to say that we are predominantly plant-based because we know so much of the benefits about adding more plant-based foods on the plate, and whatever that looks like for your family, whatever works, there's going to be benefits, especially if we're considering shifting from sort of that standard American, that more westernized typical diet.
What I
Reading
found to be so fun, and it's fun to watch the transition in my children too, is that just shifting what's served, like what the choices are for the evening. Again, my children are a little bit older, so this might not work for the younger ones, but literally whereas before we might have a starch, one or two starches, then the vegetables, then the whatever the protein of the day was. Now it's like 2 to 3 different vegetable servings or types, whether it's a salad, steamed broccoli, and other stir fry. And then whatever the starch is either non-existent or it's there in a very tiny amount. So the portion's so limited that everybody can only have a very small amount of that. And I've watched it shift their choices. It's pretty fascinating because as they shift and they eat more of sort of these whole foods and these plant-based foods, they're not asking for dessert. They're not asking for, I feel like it's just like a vicious cycle. Like you get the salt, you get the heavy foods, then you want the sugar, then you want the next thing. And like all of that shifts as their chemistry shifts. So that's been fun just in our family, not even talking about patients, but just in our family to kind of watch that transition. So other ways to transition for maybe younger children, what's the best way to do it for those little ones who, they just want their mac and cheese and their chicken fingers, right? So how do you transition them?
It's really about meeting kids where they're at, whatever age group we're talking about, is that kids thrive on familiarity. So like Alex said, you can't just show up with a brand new plate of food, all new things that they've never seen before. So one of the strategies we talk about in the book, especially for like that 1 to 2 year old picky eating period, is to always include 1 to 2 foods that you already know your child is going to like and going to eat, along with these new learning to like foods. And then while providing these foods, taking the pressure off the plate. So you're providing it in a neutral way. You're not saying you have to eat this if you want to get other food. You're not saying you have to finish your plate before you leave the table. You're just providing it and you're stepping back and you're letting your child lead the way. Of course, initially, most of the kids are going to reject these new foods, especially if they're new. But the more and more that we can expose them to these new foods and these foods that we want them to be regularly eating and do it without pressure, the more likely they are to come around to it and to eat it themselves. We find that when you pressure kids to eat certain foods, the opposite actually happens. Restriction or pressuring always backfires. And the same with restriction. When we try to tell our kids, you absolutely can't have this food, research shows that the reverse happens. They eat more of it. So it's really our job as a parent just to provide these nutritious options and then to step back and allow our children, whatever age they are, the opportunity to eat it on their own.
Yeah, I have so many stories about that. My mom was super healthy. She never bought any of the junk. And I remember standing in the grocery store line with her, like, just you wait by myself. I'm going to.
Yeah. Alex and I talk about it in the book too. Yeah, we used to call my mom the fruit and veggie police.
Yeah.
She would put out broccoli and carrots for my friends when they would come over, and I'd be so embarrassed. And then I'd go to a friend's house and I would go into their pantry and have a free for all. And so that's another thing we really dive into in the book is how your parenting style can really affect your kids' eating behaviors. So it's so important to instill these healthy behaviors at an early age.
That's happening in our home. My daughter's complained to me. She's like, I don't like having friends here because like there's no fun food to eat. It's like they're doing like your weird like gluten-free and veggie food and whatever she calls it. Sweetie, like just you have to adapt to what we've got. You have to be proud of kind of these choices. How do you handle teenagers? I probably need some advice there when it comes to food. How do you handle the teenagers? What does the research say about them? What's the best approach there? I actually tell the ones that come to the practice that are like high school, headed off to college, I'm like, this is the toughest group of patients because I'm going to give them all this advice and they're going to follow maybe one thing and all the stuff I give them. So what's the best way to handle them?
Yeah, I think teenagers are a little bit like toddlers, right? They really want to make their own decisions. What we sort of say as parents is like, yes, okay, I appreciate your comment, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's what I'm going to do. And, in a lot of ways, we have to respect that. So, we sort of take the approach of just kind of like Whitney said, we can offer these foods in our home. Doesn't mean we necessarily have to cater to all of our kids' wants and needs, but also understand that the more they feel restricted, they likely are going to go out, or when they are exposed to those foods, they perhaps might binge them. The research shows that they sort of tend to sneak these kind of foods and hide them. And, we want our kids, of course, to eat healthy, but also have a healthy relationship with food. You might be surprised as dietitians, we actually recommend things like serving dessert with meals, or allowing for some of these things in sort of the structure versus restriction way, because we want our kids to trust themselves around food and not also feel like, these foods are sort of off limits or that they're on this pedestal, because that can create a lot of other concerns when it comes to, kids feeling like this food is bad or this food is good, and sort of what that means internally to how they view themselves when they eat those foods.
Oh my goodness.
At the same time, I was just going to say, at the same time, that doesn't mean that just because you want your kids to have a healthy, balanced relationship and be able to have all foods fit, that doesn't mean that you have to bring soda and Snickers bars into your kitchen. Another option could be, well, you're having some friends over. You want to, what would you like to serve them? You think some cookies would be nice? Here's a great recipe I found. And you can use your more whole foods options in making that recipe if you'd prefer to do that at home, besides buying quote unquote junk food. So there are ways you can make it fit in your family without having like blanket restrictions.
I love those. I think those are all such doable hacks and ideas. And it is a lot about, what I'm taking away from this is a lot about letting your kids lead, which is so much of parenting in general, right? Is letting them, educating them, empowering them, but then that stepping back for a second and letting them make those choices. So I think that's such an important point. And I have already seen like some of this is good, this is bad, I'm going to starve and then binge and all that other stuff. I'm already seeing some of the early signs of that in some of our community. And it really disturbs me and bothers me. Well, I love this. What other hacks or tips do you have for parents? And I'm curious too, what your thought is on the whole baby food, switching back to a different age group completely, like prepared baby foods and all this other stuff that we see out on the marketplace. Kind of where does that fit in, to feeding our children and all that other good stuff?
Yes. So when it comes to starting solids, Alex and I, this is another place where we're really all inclusive and really recommend individualizing what you do in your house. If feeding your baby purees is what works for you, great. We talk about how to do that in the book, but we really like an approach called baby-led weaning. And this can actually be kind of combined with a traditional approach to solids using purees and mashes if you like, or you can simply do baby-led weaning. But the idea of baby-led weaning is providing kids with age and texture appropriate finger foods right from the start, so that they are feeding themselves right from the start. In which case you wouldn't be using prepared baby foods. You'd be serving baby many of the same foods that you eat, well, all of the same foods that you eat as a family, just in a slightly altered form so that it's not a choking risk and isn't high in salt and sugar, which we want to limit for babies before the age of 2. So if you're making, for example, like in the book, we've got a tofu marinara recipe. If you're doing that for the family, you're also offering it to baby. You're just using a low sodium marinara and you're cutting the tofu into strips that they can grab grab with their palm and eat right out of their hands. The Tex-Mex millet meatballs we talked about before, those can be shaped into a form where baby can feed themselves. So we're not anti store-bought purees, but like you said before, there are some concerns with the heavy metals. A lot of that, unfortunately, is actually just due to the food itself and the fact that the soil that, like carrots, for instance, or sweet potatoes are grown in, these plants uptake it from the soil. So it almost can't be avoided in many cases. I mean, this is something we could go off on a whole tangent about. Yeah. I think the issue is more about the fact that the companies aren't testing them. But even if you made it at home, your carrot could also potentially contain heavy metals, and you could be putting those things, you could be exposing them either way. The key really is offering variety. And we recommend that whether, again, you're doing a traditional approach or you're doing a baby-led weaning approach, is not heavily relying on only one type of food. We really want to expose babies early and often to as many diverse flavors and textures as possible in order to build adventurous eaters. And we think that's what baby-led weaning does but best. And then it also gets away from this kind of monotone flavor and texture that you would have with purees. But for some parents, you know, that for access reasons, for time reasons, that might be their best option. So we don't want to exactly negate that as well. But we think there's room for a combined approach instead of just doing that if you are going to incorporate them in some way.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, last question is really more for us moms. Plant-based foods, prepping them, putting them together is a little bit of work or effort. What are your favorite hacks in having all of this ready to go for your kids when you're running around doing 50 million things, maybe working as well? What are your top 3 hacks for all the moms listening who want to do this but don't want to cut up carrots and celery and zucchini all day long? So what would you tell them?
Yeah, so I will say there's nothing wrong with grabbing already cut produce from the store. I do that often. It is a little bit more expensive, but time is money. So it's also nice in time just to grab those ready to go. Then you can steam, roast, however you want to cook them. I tend to do a big batch of like roasted vegetables early in the week. My kids love them. It's a nice way to sort of incorporate some of those foods perhaps they're learning to like. So I'll do a lot of like sweet potatoes, carrots, cauliflower, broccoli. Sometimes I sneak in some beets there too, sort of an exposure option. But that's also delicious for my husband and I to put on, bowls or salads throughout the week. I like to do a big batch of grains, so just kind of switch things up. I'll cook those in my Instant Pot. Again, I can make those into, grain balls for my kids. I can add those to salads or to bowls for myself and my husband. Big batches of tofu or beans are also great. And then I do a lot of breakfast prep. So I feel like I'm not really home at lunch. I'm at the office or busy. So sort of that time in the morning where we're all sitting down together having breakfast, that's really my time where I cut up, fruit, I cut up veggies while we're sort of having a conversation. So I'm still involved. I'm still there with my kids, but I'm also getting some meal prep done either for that day or for the week ahead.
I love that. Great hacks, great tips. Thank you both for taking time out to join us and educate us on feeding our children and keeping them healthy for the long haul. If anyone listening or watching today wants to learn more or get in touch with you guys, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yes, you can follow us at PlantBased Juniors over on Instagram. We're on all channels, but Instagram is sort of our most popular option at PlantBased Juniors. You can also find us on plantbasedjuniors.com, and our brand new book is called The Plant-Based Baby and Toddler, and that is available wherever books are sold.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both so much. And for everybody else listening and watching, thank you for watching this episode of Superwoman Wellness. Remember, you can rate and review it and share it with your friends. I will see you guys next time.